Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 112. The Adults Aren't All Right. Hizashi was watching Sho and his kids like a hawk. Only two of them had taken up the school's offer for counseling, and he really wished they could have made it mandatory for everyone. He was glad Uraraka and Kirishima were getting the help they needed, but neither of them would have been his first pick student to accept the offer. It didn't do anyone any good to compare trauma, but they hadn't witnessed the worst of it. They knew Kirishima was one of the students who saw what had happened to the Nomu after All Might showed up. They knew Uraraka had led the charge of administering first aid to 13 before paramedics arrived. But neither of them had seen Shota and Midoriya be crushed and thrown around like rag dolls by that monster. They hadn't been the ones responsible for making sure the rest of their classmates didn't die. Sho had spoken to Midoriya, but apparently he hadn't said a word about what happened. He just insisted he was fine. He was clearly not fine. He sat in class with a glazed-over look in his eyes and flinched at the slightest sounds. Shota hadn't been much more forthcoming about his experiences either, and he was one more vacant stare away from forcibly beating some sense into him. He had been waking up almost every night, either thrashing or screaming loud enough to wake Hizashi up, and he couldn't imagine Midoriya was doing any better. He was losing sleep imagining the poor kid going home to an empty apartment and waking up to no one there to calm him down from his brain's torment. Yagi had told them that he had spoken to his mother on the phone, that she had been home with the kid for one measly day before she had to go back to work. What a joke! They had a meeting scheduled with her for nearly 4 weeks from now, her apparent earliest availability. Shinso and Asui didn't seem to be doing well either. Shinso's eyes never left the back of Midoriya's head for more than a few seconds, and Asui glanced over in the boy's direction every time Midoriya flinched, which was incredibly often. The whole class hardly chattered. Even the more talkative of the group, whom he had to reel in quite frequently for the first few days of class, were quiet. They had been contemplating scheduling an appointment with their own therapist, even though they hadn't been there at all. Not being there at all was traumatic in its own right, they supposed. He could tell the same issue was weighing heavily on Tenyu's shoulders. Tensei had said he'd talked to him about it, and he was working through his guilt as best he could, but Hizashi hadn't spoken to anyone. He would usually talk to Sho, but he was clearly going through his own stuff. You both look awful, Nem interrupted his train of thought. He looked up from the computer screen that he wasn't really seeing with an unamused expression on his face. Thanks, Nem. I'm serious. You look as tired as Sho usually looks, and he looks like he's got one foot in the grave, she asserted, crossing her arms across her chest. Have either of you been sleeping? They looked over to her properly, and they could see the genuine concern hidden behind the light-hearted jabs, so they let out a heavy sigh and relented. No. A frown graced her features at his response, and she pulled the chair from her desk around to sit next to him. Nightmares? She asked, seeming to already know the answer. Yeah, they confirmed anyway. I assume Sho doesn't want to talk about it? They didn't justify that with a proper response. They just looked at her, not bothering to hide the tired expression they wore, and raised their eyebrows as if to say, You're really asking me that? Figures, she scoffed with no humor. And you? You haven't talked to me, and clearly haven't talked to him, she pressed. She knew them too well. Ever the pushy older sister forcing them to get their crap together, even all these years later. He leaned forward and pressed his face into his hands as he propped his elbows up on his desk. I've been better, he admitted. She laughed at the understatement before crossing her legs and resting her elbow on Shota's desk, silently telling him that she was here to listen. They looked over the mostly empty teacher's lounge. Only Hound Dog was here with them, but they knew he knew how to mind his business. Plus, they didn't care if he overheard anything anyways. I know it wasn't my fault that I wasn't there, but he trailed off and let her draw her own conclusions. You're right. It's not your fault. You did everything you could. We all did. You're here for him now, aren't you? No one could reasonably ask any more from you. The kids, I can see it on their faces. They're not all right either. No one is expecting them to be all right, Zashi. It's only been a week. They'll bounce back, she insisted. All you can do is be here for them. And you are. You're doing everything you can. There's just nothing for it right now. Nothing but time. He knew she was right, but that didn't help the guilt that weighed on his shoulders every time Sho woke up in a cold sweat or Midoriya flinched when they signed something in class a little too enthusiastically. This guilt wasn't helping anyone. They needed to pull themselves together. Yeah, they should schedule an appointment, lead by example and all that. Hopefully, Sho would follow suit. Shota was exhausted. He hadn't known this kind of exhaustion since the night he had almost lost Ivy, which felt like eons ago, even though it had only been a little over a year. Emotional exhaustion was a different beast than physical exhaustion. He couldn't sleep. He had to force himself to eat, and he was so sick and tired of feeling his coworkers' eyes on him. Something about his stoic demeanor had always been a neon sign begging for playful taunts from his few friends and acquaintances. He'd thought he would be relieved if he could finally go a day without being purposefully annoyed by his colleagues. But now that he had it, it was more infuriating than ever. Tsukachi was the only one not treating him any differently, but he had hardly seen the man since he wasn't allowed on patrol. He'd been keeping him updated on the case, which he was grateful for. Clinically dissecting the arguably extremely traumatic events he had witnessed probably wasn't healthy, but it was better than being left to his own thoughts. It was productive at the very least. A few of his students had come to him to talk about what had happened, but for the most part, they had just wanted to know that he and Midoriya were going to be okay. It was irritating, but he understood. He felt the urge to ask Midoriya if he was okay every time he saw him, and any time he left his classroom, it felt like he was leading sheep to the slaughter, like his students would be butchered the moment he let them out of his sight. It was irrational. It was illogical, but his heart rate spiked every time first period ended regardless. He'd been getting messages from Ivy daily telling him to get off his lazy butt and get back into Uptown. They had told him that they weren't patrolling without him, but he's not sure he believed that. No one had been called in to Tsukachi, at least. So maybe they were telling the truth. They'd been pestering him for information about the break-in as well, asking if there was anything they should keep an eye out for, any way they could help the investigation, and Shota had told them under no uncertain terms that they were not to go sticking their nose into this. There were pros from all over the country on it, and he didn't want them getting wrapped up in the mess. It wasn't safe. Tsukachi and Ivy's dedication to not pitying him was one of the few things keeping him sane. That and Hizashi's steady presence. They weren't trying to pry information out of him, which he was grateful for, but he had a feeling that their patience was wearing thin. He needed to talk to someone. He knew he did, but he had never been very good at that. He was the epitome of a hypocrite, telling his students to seek help, but refusing to do so himself. He knew he couldn't keep going like this. He knew he would feel better if he got a few things off his chest, but that didn't make it any easier. Toshinori felt weak. Well, weaker than he usually did. You'd think after 5 years of this, he would be used to getting weaker, but no, he wasn't. Every time he found that he couldn't hold his form as long as he used to be able to, he was surprised. It was inevitable. He knew it was. He'd always known it was. Even before his clash with All for One, he knew, or at least he'd hoped, this power wouldn't be going to the grave with him. That didn't make it any easier to accept. 1 hour. He could hold on to the shriveling embers of One for All for 1 hour a day now. All things considered, it could have been much worse. If Midoriya hadn't told him to kill that thing, he's not sure that he would have gone to such drastic measures so soon in the fight. He can't say that he regretted it. He was horrified by what he had done, but he couldn't regret it. Those kids' lives were on the line. It wasn't an option to do things by half measures. But he was correct in his fear that those pained screams would haunt him. He watched that creature as it stopped fighting and went limp. He couldn't say that he saw the light leave its eyes because it hadn't been there to begin with. But he's not sure that that made it any better. The thought of what had almost happened plagued him more than what he'd done. If he had been just a second too late, Aizawa would have certainly died. That man who had him pinned had a touch-based disintegration quirk, and his hand was wrapped around Aizawa's throat. The only reason he wasn't already dead was because he'd been clinging onto consciousness enough to activate his quirk. And Midoriya. He didn't want to think about that, but it was all his brain seemed capable of conjuring. It had been a long, long time since he had felt so powerless. He was All Might. He was supposed to be the one that could save anyone. He knew that wasn't true. It had never been true, but he had been so close to losing the one person he couldn't afford to lose. In such a short span of time, that boy had become everything to him. In hindsight, it was frightening to see how quickly and thoroughly he had slipped his way through Toshinori's defenses. He had spent his whole life trying to push people away before they got too close, and this kid had settled himself into his guarded heart effortlessly. Every time he saw the boy, he felt his heart tear a little more. Ever since school had started up again, he had been jumpy, or at least jumpier than he normally was. He was barred from participating in heroics until he fully healed, but he watched his classmates from the sidelines like they would die if they so much as tripped. He shouldn't be worried about keeping them safe. That wasn't his job. He was a kid, just like the rest of them. He should be thinking about what he was going to do after school and stressing out about classwork, not whether or not his peers would live to see tomorrow. He knew he should talk to him, but he didn't know what to say. He knew exactly how the boy felt. He knew nothing he said was going to change how he was feeling. Maybe it would be better to get his mind off of it. The sports festival was coming up. He should be excited about that. Having something to look forward to always helped him from being bogged down by the past. Hopefully, it helped Midoriya too. Young Midoriya! All Might caught him just as he was leaving the classroom, and he damn near jumped out of his skin. Yes, All Might? A word, if you don't mind? He asked a little quieter than he usually did in his form. Yeah, sure. You guys go on without me. He dismissed his, friends. You sure, Midoriya? We can wait and catch the next train together, Uraraka offered. No, it's fine, he denied the offer quickly. Both Uraraka and Ida looked between him and All Might for a moment before relenting. Let us know when you get home, Ida insisted. He had to bite his lip to stop himself from making a face at that. They really cared about him. Why did they care so much? Yeah, of course, he answered with a nod, turning to All Might to cut off any more assertions that his friends actually cared about him. Sorry, my boy. I wanted to catch you before you left, and I didn't get the time to change. All Might apologized as he pulled the two of them into a meeting room and deflated in a puff of steam. It's all right. What did you need? I haven't gotten the chance to see you much. I wanted to catch up. I'll give you a ride home so you don't have to worry about the train, he replied with a kind smile. That smile had his heart rate settling ever so slightly. He hadn't seen Yagi in over a week. He saw All Might every day, but not Yagi. It was bittersweet to see him smile like that, knowing that he was going to be letting him down so soon. Oh, thanks, he replied and forced a small smile in return. The sports festival is right around the corner. Aren't you excited? Your first chance to show the world what you're made of. All Might asked as he busied his hands making tea for the two of them. Izuku did his best not to let himself look too exasperated by that comment. He was not looking forward to the sports festival, his speech in particular. The competition itself was fine, he supposed, but the more he thought about it, the more it sounded like an awful idea. Broadcasting information about a bunch of kids on its own was bad enough, but he himself had gathered information on many heroes' weaknesses from their sports festival performances. If he could do it, then so could someone else, and his class already had enough of a target on their heads after thwarting the League's plan to kill All Might. But if All Might wanted this to be his debut, then it would be his debut. Maybe if he did well enough, the audience wouldn't pay too much attention to his peers. However, it was more than a bit arrogant to think he could steal the show that much. God, this was such a bad idea. Yeah, I've got the speech to do. All eyes will be on me already. So that's good, he replied, doing his best to not sound like he was forcing the words out, despite his stutter. Oh, yes, the speech. I'd forgotten about that. How's it coming along? Gah! Why did he have to bring up the speech? Slowly, he replied with a rueful laugh. Oh, don't worry so much. Keep it short and sweet. Get up there, tell the world who you are, and stand proud. That's all there is to it, he dismissed with a smile as he handed Izuku his tea. That was easy for him to say. Where did All Might get his confidence? He had told him that he'd been quirkless too, hadn't he? How did he shake that off so easily? He wanted to ask him, but it didn't seem polite, so he kept his mouth shut. Thanks, he said as he took the offered cup. He wished his last few weeks of freedom didn't have to be so damn stressful. Students dropping in during his office hours petered out after the first few days. The class hadn't recovered, not by a long shot, but nearly a week after classes started up again, they seemed to have convinced themselves that things were going to be okay. He was sitting at his desk, doing his level best not to doze off, when there was a knock at the door. Come in, he stated plainly after clearing his throat. The door swung open to reveal Shinso and Asui, the two students who had been with him and Midoriya at the end. They had yet to approach him, but they had both been keeping a not-so-subtle eye on both him and Midoriya ever since the incident. He had figured it was only a matter of time before they became the 1,001st people to ask him if he was sure he was all right. He nodded for them to come in and take a seat. Asui shuffled in first, and Shinso shut the door behind them before following suit. The two looked at each other nervously before turning their attention back to him. What hero agencies are on the list that offer internships to all hero students, Hiro? Asui asked. Oh. No one had come to him asking to not participate in the sports festival. He honestly hadn't expected anyone to. Most hero students either didn't have a single bit of self-preservation in their bones, or they were too arrogant to think they needed to worry about self-preservation to begin with. The list is actually quite long. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I could print it out for you. They're mostly small C-list agencies, but there's still a great deal to be learned from them, he explained as he typed away on the keyboard looking for the file he needed. You said that teachers here are willing to take on internships as well? Shinso asked. He looked up from his computer to better gauge his expression. He sounded quite nervous, and he looked it too. Yes, most teachers have agreed to take on limited internships for those students not interested in competing in the festival, he confirmed. Shinso looked at Asui, and she raised her eyebrows in a way that said, "Go on," before he turned back to him. Are, are you one of the teachers doing that? Shinso asked, while trying to maintain eye contact, but it was shaky at best. Shota had to bite back a grin at that. His trepidation was cute. Not that Shota would ever admit it. He had been planning to offer an internship for both Shinso and Midoriya, one to keep a closer eye on, and the other because he thought that he could benefit greatly from learning to use the capture scarf. There wasn't nearly enough time to teach that one-on-one during class. Yes, I am. I assume this is a request, he replied. Yes, Shinso answered with wide eyes, clearly put off by Shota's bluntness. Request accepted. Do you still want a copy of the list? He shot back. He had to bite back another grin when the kid's eyes went even wider. They looked liable to pop right out of his head. He glanced over to Asui again, who was looking back at her classmate with a grin. No, thank you, Shinso sputtered out. Good, saves paper, he replied, turning his attention back to the file he needed to print. The room was silent until the printer hummed to life behind him and printed out a single sheet, which he handed to Asui. You both can still participate if you'd like to. I'll give you the alternative assignments tomorrow, and you can make a decision based on that. No choice is final until the first round of the festival starts, so you can think on that as long as you want, he explained as he sat back down at the desk. Asui was already going over the list, and Shinso looked like he might be about to shit himself if he was being honest. Shota had to chew on the inside of his lip to keep a straight face. Anything else? He asked, throwing the poor kid a rope. Asui glanced up and shook her head, and Shinso sputtered out a "No, sir," before they both took their leave. He had known since before the school year even started that he was going to have his work cut out for him with this lot. No other batch of students had ever been awarded as many rescue points as they had been, nearly across the board. He was expecting the lack of self-preservation to be more egregious than ever, so he was pleasantly surprised that at least 2 of his kids had survival instincts. 2 out of 20 could be worse. He was firmly in the camp of his colleagues who thought holding the sports festival was an awful idea. But they were funded by the commission, and what they said was law, so the show must go on. He sincerely hoped that the targets on his students' backs would not be painted any larger after this was all said and done. End of chapter.